Welcome to the March 11th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today we're going to be talking about the working title for the show Is Canada Secure from Trump Invasion? I never thought I would utter those words, but here we are. My guest today is Simon Dalby, a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University who specializes in energy transition and national security. So welcome to The Energy Show, Simon.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
We should probably mention that this morning, Trump put a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, and the Canadian government responded, as it had promised, with $30 billion of tariffs on a variety of very targeted U.S. products, including computers, sports equipment, cast iron products, all sorts of things. The idea is to target Republican parts of the country, I imagine. Have you studied, is there any precedent for this kind of action from one state to another, one government, formerly friendly and all of a sudden not, and using tariffs as a means of intimidating, bullying the neighbor?
It's certainly unusual. I'm sure there's a historical precedent, one place or another, but it's not coming to mind immediately. The extraordinary speed with which things have changed since Trump was inaugurated really is quite breathtaking. But it does raise all sorts of questions for Canada about, well, are we really secure in North America? We used to think we were until last December. Everything seemed to be just fine. Now, suddenly, Trump has really raised the questions about what Canadian security means. We are also in the extraordinary situation that it has raised fundamental questions in the United States too. I think it was yesterday that a Democratic House of Congress member actually introduced a bill in the House of Representatives, which is titled about preventing invading allies. Wait a minute. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. It is, of course, an attempt by the folks in the House of Representatives to reassert congressional power over declarations of war, which has sort of eroded for the last mostly through the Cold War. But it does raise for Canadians really serious questions about: is he serious? Could he do this? If so, what would the consequences be? And the consequences would probably be very serious. It does then raise, really big questions about how does Canada prepare to prevent such an event, and where are we particularly vulnerable? Which, of course, inevitably brings us back to questions of energy.
Right. So I was reading a Substack by Malcolm Nance, who is an American strategist. And it was very alarming. He said the decision to invade Canada has been made. It's only now a question of when and where, which was very disturbing. And so he's someone to be taken seriously. He's not a kook or a conspiracy theorist, as far as I can tell. If that's the case, then to answer or to address your questions, how can Canada make itself secure from American invasion?
We don't have a military that is capable of preventing a full-scale military invasion if it comes from the United States. And that's, of course, precisely the problem that we are now faced with, if, in fact, that Substack commentary is correct. The most important thing, of course, is to prevent it happening. Hence, it is crucially important that we get the attention of lots of people in the United States who can basically thwart that decision. If that happens, I mean, if the American military does try to take over Canada, the whole world order that we have known for the last 2/3 of a century, at least, is over, because America has been the guarantor of security for much of the Western world. And it obviously, if it's planning on invading its allies, is suddenly no longer that guarantor. Would European countries come to our aid if we invoked Article 5 of the NATO treaty? They are obligated to do so, except that the NATO treaty was always designed to come to the aid of NATO countries that were being invaded by people outside NATO. So we are facing this extraordinary situation. one that, as you said, is alarming, precisely because if the decision has in fact been made, and it seems from what Melanie Joly and Justin Trudeau were saying last week, that clearly plans to annex Canada are very much on Trump's mind. So we are now facing a situation of scrambling to look at our vulnerabilities and to think what we might do. Politically, preventing it has to be strategy number one, obviously. And that's what much of this tariff discussion is about, trying to get the attention of American policymakers so that they can move to prevent this is obviously national security strategy number one.
Is it possible that the checks and balances in the American Constitution could be used to prevent Trump from invading Canada? And the reason I mention this is I interviewed Professor Kristen van de Biesenbos, she's a lawyer, a legal scholar, and she was saying the issue is if Trump tries to expand executive power, will the checks and balances in Congress and in the judiciary, will they hold? The guardrails, will they hold?
Yep.
And so Trump is clearly trying to do that, and he's not very subtle about it. So how does that work from a military perspective? Can the military say, hey, we're not going to do that? Or we're going to take direction from Congress? How does that work?
I think that's exactly the crucial question. What would the military do? What's alarming, of course, is that Trump has been firing a lot of senior military folks. Presumably, he's looking for loyalists that will do his bidding regardless of the constitutional niceties, regardless of whether the decisions that he wishes to have implemented make much sense in a military or security sense. This is, of course, the big question. The Substack commentary that you mentioned does raise the question of which units would, in the American military, would agree to actually carry out those orders. It's very tricky because, remember, particularly with NORAD, Canadian and American officers and commanders and equipment are all interconnected pretty much seamlessly. How you would rapidly take that apart to facilitate invasion is a very good question. The practicalities of all sorts of other interoperable systems also make an American military invasion of Canada tricky, simply because we're interconnected in so many ways. What might happen, McNance's commentary suggests that the 10th Division that is sitting north of Syracuse there, which would be the obvious land force that would have to move north for Ottawa and Montreal, all of those officers have got good Canadian friends. They simply might refuse point blank to do this madness. It's quite clear to anybody that pays any attention that Canada is no threat to the United States. There's no military rationale for doing it. We've been a good ally for a very long time, as every Canadian politician likes to point out repeatedly over the last week or two. The real question then is what would the military do? And frankly, I don't think anybody, probably anybody in the US military themselves, actually knows at this point, because it's such an outrageous, novel circumstance. There's probably some contingency plans to do it lying around in the bowels of the Pentagon. That is entirely predictable because militaries do contingency planning all the time. And that when one would be puzzled if there wasn't a contingency plan lying around somewhere. But operationalizing it is a whole different story.
One of the other points that Nance made in his Substack was that an invasion of Canada would, and he said, would certainly kick off a second civil war in the United States. Yep. And if that were to happen, part of the military stays loyal to Trump, part of the military stays loyal to Congress, and then goodness knows what happens. At that point, it just seems like chaos.
I think that would be exactly right. And how that might play out, it's just simply impossible to predict.
Goodness. Well, so the political option is the first and foremost option for preventing an invasion. Is there anything else we can do? Like I've seen suggestions in the media that maybe what would happen is there would be a guerrilla war, like when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I can imagine. I think the Americans would be very surprised how many hunting rifles there are in Canada. We don't have a lot of pistols and AR-15s, but high velocity hunting rifles we got tons. We have a lot of.
Plenty of those. And indeed, if I remember correctly from Richard Romer's interview with Steve Paikin yesterday, he was suggesting that in his novel back in 50 years ago about the American invasion of Canada, this was exactly what he suggested would happen. The hunting rifles would come out, and the American occupiers would discover that there was a lot of very good snipers in Canada. And their invading forces would be vulnerable. Their high-tech military put a few high-velocity bullets through an F-35, and it's not going to fly very effectively. The point here is that resistance would inevitably grow, and that in turn would destabilize both America and Canada even further. Again, speculation on this is just that. It's speculation. Let us hope and work towards preventing this nonsense actually happening.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because you and I have had we've emailed back and forth about the creation of a national power grid, and that's difficult in some respects because the distance between population centers in Manitoba and Ontario across the national shield is very great. So there'd be difficulty building infrastructure. But there has been suggested that we could have two power grids, one in the west and one in the east. That might work. But the importance of clean, reliable, low-cost electricity to the economy. Here at Energy Media, we've been arguing this for a long time. That's the foundation of a 21st century economy. Yep. That if you want to be secure economically, you have to have that because that is what your customers are going to require, and there's no debate about it. We're lucky we have a lot of that already. Is doing more east-west trade between the provinces a part of our response to making Canada more, at least economically secure against, American incursion, American threats?
Yes, it is. The politicians have been moving on this quickly in the last week, suggesting that interprovincial trade barriers are something that needs to come down. There's been quite a bit of bureaucrat bashing in the media on this, which worries me because there are sometimes very good reasons for provinces having different regulations. If you are driving the highways of British Columbia, having a license and making sure you've got the proper chains for your truck in winter is obviously something that might be much less important to the folks in Nova Scotia, for instance. We need to stop and think carefully about where it is that there are rules and regulations that make sense given the sheer diversity of Canada's geography. But that said, trying to get British Columbia wines, if you're in a liquor store in Ontario, where I used to live, was sometimes tricky, and vice versa. Those kinds of things, I think, we can fix fairly quickly. It makes good sense to link up our grids. Certainly, it would be much easier to do Manitoba to British Columbia than it would be to do British Columbia to Nova Scotia in terms of electric grid, obviously. But nonetheless, it's something we really do need to stop and think long and hard about. As climate change accelerates, and it is doing so regardless of Trumpist headlines, if I can put it that way, climate change is not going away. It is accelerating. It is going to make us more vulnerable in all sorts of ways. If climate disruptions, the whiplash climate response, to use the current term, because increasingly we are living in a world where the patterns of the past in terms of weather are no longer the reliable predictors of what's coming. having redundancy built into our electrical systems, given the fact we don't know when we're going to get droughts or huge storms, just makes eminently good sense, keeping us all more secure in numerous different ways.
Well, I should point out that in Western Canada, there are interties between the provinces. The problem is they're very small. I think the one between Saskatchewan and Alberta is 250 megawatts, and the one between BC and Alberta is about 1,200 megawatts. But it's been throttled down to about a quarter of what it should be for whatever reason. There's a bit of a dispute there between Alberta and BC about why it's not running at full speed. But it's there, and there are some technical questions that I'm sure engineers will have to engineer solutions for. Apparently, some of the grids operate at different frequencies and so on. But I'm assured by engineers who know that this is solutions can be found. But the idea of building more east-west trade so that the hydro provinces of BC and Manitoba bookend Alberta and Saskatchewan, which have tremendous renewable potential, and combining those two, using the hydro dams basically as as big batteries. Economists have been saying for decades that is a really smart way to go. And the only thing standing in the way of making it a go is politics, political tensions between the provinces. And here we have a national crisis. Can that be the catalyst to get us over the hump and actually make this happen?
Well, let's hope so, because in crisis, opportunity sometimes presents itself, and this clearly would be an opportunity to think about building electrical infrastructure that makes us all more secure. Your point about the renewables, the wind and the solar being good on the prairies, the dams being good in other circumstances, emphasizes the point that we need to be working with a diverse set of electrical sources. And I'm a great fan of pump storage, as it's called. You run the turbines backwards to refill the dams when you have surplus power from other sources. If you haven't figured out, once upon a time I came from Ireland, and indeed there's a pump storage facility in the Wicklow Mountains built in the late 60s and early 70s to do precisely this. It's an old, reliable technology. And the Norwegians are talking a lot about it recently too. It's the kind of innovation that can be done and needs to be done in terms of providing a much more reliable backup for intermittent generation, which is, of course, one of the issues with electricity most of the time.
Yesterday, we did the show, and it was about it was titled "Has OPEC eaten? How OPEC ate Danielle Smith's brain?" And the whole point of this is that OPEC has done some extensive modeling about where oil demand and gas demand, no, primarily oil demand, is going up to 2050, and they see a golden age of oil coming. Now, Danielle Smith has adopted that philosophy, that worldview, and so she wants to see a big expansion of oil and gas in Alberta. It's not going to happen. We here at Energy Media subscribe to the IEA's forecast of peak oil demand by 2030. Nevertheless, the point I'm getting at is the folks like Danielle Smith argue that greater oil and gas exports and production are required for energy security. But then on the other side are the energy transition analysts that we cover quite extensively here. And they say, on the contrary, generating your electricity domestically so that you don't require exports actually increases energy security and increases the security of your economy. And it was the direct opposite argument that Smith and et cetera make. What do you make of that?
What I've been trying to do in quite a lot of my recent writing is pull electricity out of the energy discussion and separate it out from fuel, because fossil fuels are just that, fuels. And they are, of course, the source of climate change problems, which is, the big long-term elephant in the room we simply have to start paying more attention to. My argument there is that we are, well, societies in general, not just Canadians, are triply vulnerable in terms of how they rely on fuel. Vulnerable because of the disruptions that are coming from climate change. The sooner we stop burning stuff, the sooner we begin to slow down the production of greenhouse gases. The sooner we do that, the sooner we can begin to get a handle on some of the disruptions that are coming. But it's also a matter of the vulnerabilities of supply. I mean, Nova Scotia still imports a whole lot of oil. It's dependent on international energy markets. If it was relying on domestically generated electricity, it would not be exporting large amounts of money. It would also not be vulnerable if there's a major squabble in the Middle East that disrupts the world markets. If Venezuela ends up in even worse trouble and can no longer export oil into the Atlantic, et cetera, et cetera. The long-term supplies. The other thing, of course, which makes us all a bit vulnerable depending on fuel is because of the strange marketing arrangements, because of the vulnerabilities of oil systems to price fluctuations that are a knock-on effect of supply disruptions. Budgeting for governments, for businesses, for households is tricky when you've no idea whether when the fuel is going to arrive and how much it's going to cost. So there's a triple whammy in terms of our dependence on fuel. And if we can begin to build an economy that doesn't rely on fuel, both for cars, for trucks, for heating, for powering electrical generation, industrial purposes too, then we get ourselves off a dependence on a substance which is making us all insecure in terms of climate vulnerabilities too. We also do other things, of course, because one of the things that tends to get forgotten in this debate is the sheer amount of steel, the sheer amount of other materials that go into tankers, trucks, pipelines, refineries, all the infrastructure that stores and moves fuel. It's a huge amount of materials. The ecological consequences are far greater than they are in terms of making solar panels, windmills, and power lines. That's a whole lot more ecological friendly than the oil infrastructure. So we get a whole series of ecological benefits if we can get ourselves off fuel.
I want to make the point, we'll maybe wrap up the interview with this part of the discussion, Simon. And as you know, we've called for a national energy strategy. And I really like the idea of addressing what economy do we want. And the reason I'll use an example that from Alberta. Most of the oil that gets exported from Canada into the United States is ultra heavy sour crude. It comes out of the oil sands, about 3.4 million barrels a day. The Alberta Innovates provincial owned agency is a year away maybe from a process that will turn bitumen into carbon fiber precursor, the thing that you make carbon fiber out of. They own the intellectual property, they'll own the process basically. I can imagine a world in which Alberta stops selling bitumen as fuel, as feedstock for fuel, and makes it feedstock for materials manufacturing. And you build an industry in Alberta that takes the bitumen from northern Alberta and then manufactures it into carbon fiber and asphalt binder and all sorts of other things. Not only do you create almost 4 times the value that you would get if you sent it to a refinery, but now you're not depending on foreign markets for your fuel. You've turned it into a material. You can sell it into automotive industry in Asia, wherever you want to go. And that's the kind of economic security, I guess, I was talking about in respect to protecting Canada from American aggression, economic aggression anyway. It kind of insulates us from the Americans.
And that makes eminently good sense to think about what kind of economy we need in the future. One of the lines I like to use is there's a huge irony in all of this, because the guy who gave us the slogan we need for the future electrical economy is, of course, Ronald Reagan. because way back in the day, long before he became a politician, he was a pitchman for various electric consumer gadgets and gizmos. And his slogan was "Live better electrically." So, I mean, Reagan is the guy who's given us the slogan that we need to focus on in terms of building a better electricity-based economy and getting ourselves off these increasingly dirty and dangerous fuels that are making us so insecure in so many different ways. And I think that if we can think about a national electricity strategy rather than a national energy strategy, because, of course, there are all sorts of political difficulties in Alberta in particular from national energy, using that phrase, going back to the 1970s. Can we think about the next economy, what comes after fuel, in terms of a national electricity strategy or a national electrification strategy? I think that has a resonance that might work for particularly the younger generation, thinking about what kind of future they will be living in. But I also think it would have the advantage of focusing explicitly on where we need to put our priorities, building power lines, not pipelines, thinking about electricity explicitly, and disconnecting the notion of fuel, which is the problem, from energy, which is what we need. And I think that rhetorically, that kind of a political strategy is something we need to move forward on, and it should make us more secure in various ways, regardless of how the whole Trump thing plays out in the next year or two.
Well, Simon, this has been a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it. And this tension with Trump is not going away. I'm afraid that we're likely to have 4 more years of it, which is, it just exhausts me thinking about it. But nevertheless, here we are.
But it's the world we live in, and we have to face up to it, which is why I think, what I was saying earlier about strategy one has to be to convince any Americans that to get on the phone and get Trump stopped from the worst excesses of what he's trying to do. That's not going to be easy, but there's an awful lot of Americans that are going to end up seriously hurt if Trump continues. If he ends up with a military invasion of Canada, it's going to destabilize things much more, and an awful lot more people are going to be insecure in numerous different ways. So this is the moment at which we have to find ways to convince our American friends to get to work politically to stop this madness.
I will leave you with the words of Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, who said that civilizations rise and fall depending on how their leadership responds to existential crises. And clearly, Canada has an existential crisis. Will our leadership rise to it? So far, I'm encouraged. I think it's been good. The Americans, not so good. We'll see how they fare. But Simon, thank you very much. We'll look forward to our next interview.
Good enough. We'll talk to you again soon, Markham. Bye.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.